The sky hung heavy with dense grey clouds.
Snow fell in relentless sheets.
The streets were empty. Cars lay abandoned in the drifts. Buildings stood as lifeless monoliths.
Their windows were covered in frost.
The air was silent except for the howling wind. It was the beginning of the end. Evan pushed through the knee-deep snow.
His breath came out in invisible puffs.
Each step felt heavier than the last. His coat was old and frayed. It did little to protect him from the biting cold.
He gripped a metal pole for balance.
The city had become a labyrinth of ice.
Navigation was nearly impossible.
2 days had passed since the storm began.
At first, people thought it was temporary. They hoped the snow would stop.
But it did not.
Temperatures dropped to record lows.
The government declared a state of emergency. Roads were blocked.
Power lines snapped under the weight of ice. Communication networks failed.
Chaos erupted. Evan had been at home when it started. He lived in a small apartment on the 3rd floor.
The windows leaked cold air despite his efforts to seal them.
He lit every candle he could find. The power went out within hours. The radio gave sparse updates. Most messages were warnings.
Stay indoors.
Conserve heat. Help would arrive soon. That promise grew hollow. He carried a backpack filled with supplies. Water bottles rattled against tins of soup.
A flashlight hung from the side. Batteries were precious now. He scanned the horizon for signs of life. None appeared.
He adjusted his scarf. Frost clung to the fabric.
His hands were numb even inside thick gloves. He wondered how long he could survive like this.
The city was an icy graveyard. Shadows danced across the snow.
It was hard to tell where one street ended and another began. He reached an intersection.
A traffic light was frozen in mid-blink.
He paused to catch his breath.
The storm's fury had lessened slightly. Snowflakes drifted lazily now. He felt a fleeting sense of calm. Movement caught his eye. A figure stumbled out of a building. They were wrapped in layers of clothing. Their face was obscured by a hood. They clutched a bundle to their chest. Evan hesitated. The figure turned toward him. They raised a hand. He stepped forward cautiously. The bundle shifted. It was a child. The stranger's voice was hoarse.
They pleaded for help.
Evan gestured for them to follow.
He led them to a sheltered alcove.
It was shielded from the wind. The stranger collapsed against the wall. The child whimpered softly. Evan opened his pack. He offered a blanket. The stranger accepted with shaking hands.
They introduced themselves as Mara. Mara explained that she had been searching for food.
Her apartment was no longer safe. The cold had breached every corner. Pipes burst. Walls cracked.
She feared for her child's life.
Evan listened intently.
He knew the desperation well.
He decided they would stick together. Safety was easier in numbers.
Trust was rare now, but it was necessary. They planned their next move. Supplies were scarce.
Many stores had been looted.
The best chance was the community center. It was a few blocks away.
Rumors said it had heat. Some claimed it still had power. Others said it was abandoned.
They had to find out for themselves.
Evan and Mara set out together. The child clung to Mara's side. The storm seemed to mock their efforts.
The wind picked up again. Snow lashed their faces. Visibility was poor.
They stayed close to the buildings. Windows were dark and lifeless. Some were shattered. Ice covered everything.
As they walked, Mara shared her story.
She had moved to New Aurora a year ago. Her husband worked overseas. He was stranded when the storm began.
She had no way to contact him. She spoke of her fears. She did not know how long they could last. Evan nodded in understanding. He felt the same uncertainty.
They reached the community center by nightfall. The building loomed before them.
Its roof sagged under the weight of snow.
The doors were slightly ajar.
A faint glow came from within. They approached cautiously.
The sound of footsteps echoed inside.
Evan tightened his grip on the metal pole.
He pushed the door open. The air inside was marginally warmer. The faint glow came from a fire in the center of the room. Several people were gathered around it. Their faces were gaunt. Their clothes were patched and layered.
A few turned to look as Evan and Mara entered.
Suspicion flashed in their eyes. One man stood up. He was tall and wiry.
He held a crowbar in his hand.
He asked who they were. Evan raised his hands to show he meant no harm.
Mara stepped forward. She explained their situation. She spoke of the child's need for warmth.
The man hesitated.
Then he nodded and gestured for them to come closer.
The fire was small but steady. Its heat was a lifeline.
Mara knelt by the fire.
She pulled the child close. Evan sat down slowly.
He kept the metal pole within reach.
The others introduced themselves. The tall man's name was Jonas. He had been a construction worker before the storm. He had been in the middle of a project when the world froze over. Another woman was named Clara.
She worked as a nurse. She had been treating patients at the hospital when the power went out.
Others shared similar stories.
Ordinary lives interrupted by catastrophe.
The group had been at the center for 3 days. They had scavenged what they could from nearby stores.
The supplies were running low.
Jonas said they needed a new plan. He had heard rumors of a relief station on the outskirts of the city. It was said to have food and medical supplies. But the journey was dangerous. The roads were treacherous. The cold was deadly. Evan volunteered to go.
Mara looked at him with alarm. She said it was too risky. But he insisted. He could not sit and do nothing. He had survived this long by moving forward.
Jonas agreed to go with him. The others would stay behind. They would ration what little they had. Clara would look after the child. They left at dawn. The sky was still dark. The storm had eased slightly. But the cold was relentless. Jonas carried a backpack filled with tools.
Evan gripped his metal pole tightly.
They moved quickly. The city stretched before them like a frozen wasteland. Every step felt like a battle. They followed a map Jonas had drawn.
It was based on fragments of information he had gathered. The relief station was at an old warehouse.
It was on the edge of the industrial district. The journey would take several hours. They walked in silence.
The only sound was the crunch of snow underfoot.
The industrial district was eerily quiet.
Factories stood as lifeless giants.
Chimneys were coated in ice. Machines were frozen in place. Evan and Jonas moved cautiously. They passed a row of trucks. Their engines were buried under snow.
They finally spotted the warehouse.
It was surrounded by a chain-link fence. The gate was partially open. They approached the building. Jonas signaled for Evan to stop. He pointed to tracks in the snow. They were fresh. Someone else had been here recently. They entered the warehouse slowly.
The air was colder inside than out. Shelves lined the walls.
Most were empty.
In the center of the room was a pile of supplies. Cans of food, bottles of water, blankets.
It was more than they had hoped for. A sound echoed through the building.
Footsteps.
Jonas raised his crowbar.
Evan tightened his grip on the pole. A group of people emerged from the shadows.
They were armed with makeshift weapons. Their leader stepped forward. He was a burly man with a scar across his face. He demanded to know what Evan and Jonas were doing there. Jonas tried to explain.
He said they were looking for supplies. He said they had a group at the community center.
The leader laughed coldly.
He said the supplies belonged to them. He said anyone who tried to take them would pay the price.
Jonas did not back down.
He said they needed the supplies to survive.
The tension in the room was palpable. The leader signaled to his group. They moved closer. Jonas swung the crowbar. The fight was chaotic. Weapons clashed. Shouts echoed through the warehouse.
Evan fought with everything he had.
The metal pole struck against a makeshift shield. Jonas held his ground. The attackers were relentless. Evan managed to disarm one of them. He grabbed a can of food and threw it toward Jonas. Jonas caught it and shouted for Evan to run.
They grabbed as many supplies as they could carry. They pushed their way out of the warehouse.
The attackers pursued them.
Snow flew in all directions as they fled.
They reached the edge of the industrial district. The attackers stopped following.
Evan and Jonas collapsed behind a wall.
Their breath came in ragged gasps. Their hands were shaking. Jonas laughed bitterly.
He said they had been lucky. Evan nodded.
He looked at the supplies they had managed to take. It was not much,
but it was enough to make a difference.